Hey guys, so I thought I'd continue with the book, The Horrors of Fox Hollow Farm. I can't believe I forgot about it, considering how interested I was. But anyways, I found a clip here that I haven't seen yet. I watched like the first minute or so, and it doesn't look like, I think it was this one. Oh no, this is only 41 seconds. Anyways, let's watch.
A victim of a 1990 serial killer in Hamilton County has been identified tonight. The Hamilton County coroner says remains found at Fox Hollow Farm in the 1996 match those of Jeffrey Jones. Authorities used a family reference sample submitted last year to confirm Jones was reported missing in Indianapolis to police in August 1993. According to authorities, this is the 12th victim identified. Authorities started searching the Westfield property again last year looking for potential victims. Herb Baumeister was the suspect in a series of killings when he took his own life in 1996. Authorities believe he lured men to his home in the 1980s and 90s before then killing them there.
Here's something else I found. Just pause to read. So now I'm on Welcome Back. 18 months had passed since my first visit to Fox Hollow Farm, and many questions still remained to be answered. As far as I was concerned, I was completely satisfied that the location was indeed truly haunted. I still could not say with any degree of confidence exactly who or what was behind it all. It would have been easy to jump to the conclusion that the spirit of Herr Baumeister still lingered there, perhaps resistant to moving on to whatever it is that awaits us once our time here is done. After all, no matter what one's personal belief system is, most would agree that he had an appointment with some sort of spiritual justice waiting for him. Yet, I had heard other stories too while I was conducting background research on this case. Sorry, my mouth's not mouthing today. I don't know what's going on. A number of investigations told me that they suspected a completely inhuman entity was behind the haunting, and that much of the paranormal activity taking place there was falsely attributed to the spirit of Herr Baumeister or those of the victims. I truly hoped that the latter part wasn't true, because I really did not want to think of those poor young men still hanging around at Fox Hollow Farm so many years after their tragic demise. Rob and Vicky, which are the owners of the house, kindly invited me to come back and spend a few more days investigating the house. This was expanding the scope to encompass the apartment in which Herb had once been said to live when his marriage was in dire straits. This time I wanted to go when the weather was warm enough for us to spend more time outside in the woods. Once again, I chose a small, trusted team to accompany me. Cognizant of the stories that claimed that there was something dark and sinister haunting Fox Hollow Farm, I consulted with my friend and fellow paranormal investigator, Stephen Wiedner, who happened to be a Catholic priest and also claimed to be sensitive, among many other things. I wanted his expert opinion on what we might encounter at such a place. He had been very accurate in the past when reading locations remotely, and I figured that I had nothing to lose. Stephen told me that he was getting the distinct impression that the farm had been quieter, paranormally speaking, over the last few years than at any other time since the Graves family had moved in. Rob confirmed this was indeed true. Then he went on to say that much of the negative activity was usually attributed to Herr Baumeister, which actually wasn't him at all. Rather, it was coming from something that wasn't entirely human, in his words, but instead had been drawn to Fox Hollow Farm because of the dark and terrible events that had taken place there. That makes sense. All the hurt, all the pain, the anger, all of that stuff. Yeah, definitely I could see that. He claimed that this non-human entity liked nothing better than to impersonate the spirit of Herr Baumeister for its own murky purpose. Wow. Herb does still drop in from time to time, Stephen went on, but he isn't resident there. Like some people seem to think he is. He's not around very much at all. What about the other spirits, I asked, trying not to ask questions that were too leading. There's some others still earthbound to there, he said. They may be some of his former victims, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Again, that fitted with what others had told me during the interviews, but I truly hoped it wasn't the case. Jason went back on board, practically salivating at the prospect of returning to one of his favorite haunted locations for a second bite at the cherry. Accompanying us was Caitlin, a professional academic with a background in religious and theology studies, and Anna, who had made a career in hospitality management. Both were skilled investigators, extremely level headed, and extremely eager to put boots on the ground at Fox Hollow Farm for a few days. The weather was balmy and the skies were clear when we landed in Indianapolis, checking onto the same hotel we had before. Rob and Vicky welcomed us to Fox Hollow Farm a little before the sunset, and the last vestiges of daylight allowed Rob to take Kaylin and Anna on a tour of the grounds before we went into the main house itself when night fell. You have to understand that none of these houses were here at the time of the murders, Rob explained, pointing to the array of private homes that now bordered Fox Hollow Farm on all sides. Although there were still trees scattered in clumps around their neighborhood, most of them were cleared away when the new residences were built. Back in Herr Baumeister's day, the farm was completely screened off from the rest of the outside world, which was why he would have been perfectly safe to drag the bodies of his victims out into the woods without any of the neighbors catching any sight of him of what he was doing. They accompanied Rob on his tour, asking several on-point questions and getting a feel for the location, its overall layout, and the Baumeister story in general. By the time Rob had finished talking, well over an hour had passed, and I was getting antsy. I wanted to investigate and see what had changed since our last visit. Would the spirits of Fox Hollow Farm still be willing to put in an appearance? We would have to see. Rob and I spent some time catching up, and I made a point of relaying the information that Stephen Wiedner had given me regarding the inhuman entity that he believed was behind the haunting itself. It doesn't surprise me at all because I've heard it from quite a few people, Rob said. Remember that Native American shaman told me that very same thing. I had spent some time talking on the phone with Tony Harris, and what Tony had told me was almost identical. He referred to the entity as the frog, saying that it had almost amphibian appearance, complete with a toad-like face. Tony claimed that the frog resided primarily in the swimming pool, or its immediate vicinity through it was supposedly able to travel throughout the house and grounds if it felt so inclined. That's weird. I've never heard about this frog thing. The whole frog thing sounded very far-fetched. And H.P. Lovecraftian in nature to me. But I was determined to keep an open mind in the subject to see whether my fellow investigators and I could gather any evidence to support or debunk. Anyway, I'll leave you all to your own devices, Rob said, offering a cheerful wave and heading back upstairs. Now that the two newcomers had gotten an orientation of sorts to Fox Hollow Farm, Caitlin, Anna, and Jason and I conferred briefly about where to begin our investigation. As it had been too cold to do much work outdoors during our first visit, Jason and I were keen to conduct an EVP session out in the woods. After some discussion, we selected the burn pile, located directly behind the house, at the foot of the earth. We all took great care to maintain very respectful and positive attitude, being only too aware that this was essentially a gravesite and deserved to be treated with reverence. The air was hot and humid beneath the canopy of the trees, despite the fact that the sun was almost totally below the horizon. Taking up positions in a circle, the four of us set digital recorders running and placed them on the ground next to us, then began asking polite questions of any spirits that might be present. Other than the hooting of a nearby owl and the ever-present soundtrack of a birdsong, the woods were quiet and peaceful. We didn't see, hear, or sense anything out of the ordinary, and when we played back the recorded files, no unheard voices had manifested EVPs. Our next target area was the locker room, adjacent to the swimming pool. A number of people I'd spoken to had said that they found the locker room to be creepy, if not downright unnerving, and so it seemed like a good place to pay a little more attention to. The session was relatively brief, and about 20 minutes or so, but fruitful. When we began asking questions about the house and the events that had taken place there, what sounded very much like footsteps could be heard in the hallway outside. As the doors leading in from the yard and the top of the staircase were closed and locked, there should have been nobody around to make those footsteps, which were picked up very clearly on our digital voice recorders. Because we had gotten some interesting results in the pool's pump room during our first investigation, we elected to try an EVP session in there with all four members of our team taking part. After carefully positioning our equipment and setting a digital voice recorder running, the four of us lined up along the back wall and took it in turn, asking questions. We began with the usual suspects. Is anybody there? What happened in this room? Before getting a little more specific. We heard that a non-human entity may be present in this location, Caitlin said. Is that true? The screech took us all by surprise. What the hell was that? Jason asked. We were all thinking the same thing. No sooner had the words left Caitlin's mouth than a cry of some sort came from somewhere else in the house. We had all heard it. Immediately, I stopped the voice recorder and played back the file. It had captured the sound perfectly. We huddled around the speaker, relaying the segment over and over again, then began searching for a rational explanation for the high-pitched noise. Could it have been an owl, perhaps, or some other nocturnal hunter? Perhaps but we considered it to be unlikely for starters. It sounded to us very much as if it had come from inside the house, rather than outside in the woods. In addition to that, Jason and I now spent the better part of 8 nights at Fox Hollow Farm, and we had never heard anything like that at all. Neither had Anna or Caitlin. We had all spent hours in the woods behind Fox Hollow and hadn't heard anything remotely like that. The timing of the screech was also suspiciously coincidental, coming as it did right on the heels of Caitlin's question about an inhuman entity being present. Of course, even a broken clock tells the correct time twice a day, so it's possible that this was simply an instance of split-second coincidental timing. Though personally, I doubt it. Had we recorded the sound of what some claim is a malevolent, inhuman entity, or nothing more than the cry of a creature in the forest, to this day, I cannot say for sure. I was trying to find that EVP of the screech. It's going to take me a bit, but when I do, I'll play it in my next video. The thump of footsteps on the staircase announced the arrival of a familiar face. Once again, Joe LeBlanc had graciously accepted our invitation to come and investigate with us. Based upon the crazy levels of electromagnetic activity, we had gotten to the pump room on his previous visit. I was optimistic that his presence might entice whatever it was that haunted this place to come out and interact with us. Rather than retread old ground, I elected instead to spend some time up in his former residence, the apartment. It had been off limits during our first investigation because one of the Graves' sons, whose room it was sleeping there, but tonight he had gone to spend the evening elsewhere and had kindly agreed to let us have the run of the place until sunrise. It was an offer that I was not going to turn down. This must bring back some memories, I said after we had climbed the steep outer staircase and entered the small living room. There was the same door in which Joe had heard loud banging on many an occasion, and the same knocker that had lifted itself up onto the vertical position and held itself there in direct violation of the laws of physics. It sure does, Joe agreed, looking around and no doubt comparing the changes made by its current occupant to how it had looked when he first moved in. This door knocker always used to knock itself at the same time, 1:45 in the morning. There were 7 knocks each time. Always 7 knocks. No more, no less. When Rob's son woke him up to tell him that somebody was knocking on the door to his bedroom, that was also 1:45 a.m. That was intriguing. The same pattern repeating itself over and over again, to my mind, it was more likely to be a residual phenomenon than an intelligent one. Perhaps some kind of psychic leftover from the days in which the Baumeisters had lived at Fox Hollow Farm. Joe had encountered somebody close to the family one day, we shall keep that man's identity anonymous, who had said that during his divorce, Herb had lived in the in-law apartment rather than the main house, and that sometimes, when he came home late and found himself locked out, he would climb the wooden staircase and knock on the door in an attempt to get somebody to open it. It was an intriguing story, and if true, which we cannot prove or disprove, it would go some way to explain the phantom noises that disturbed both Joe and the Graves' son. I took the opportunity to ask Joe something that had been on my mind recently. During our first visit, he had strongly believed that the spirit of Herb Baumeister was responsible for the paranormal assault he had suffered while he was living at the Fox Hollow. Having now heard from more than one source that the spirit of Herb Baumeister was no longer at the farm, did he still believe that Herb was responsible for the paranormal activity that took place there? I believe it's the victims. I believe that was a victim that went to Joe's apartment door when he was living there and was trying to get in, and he was running from Herb. The reason why I believe that is because it was a knock at 1:45 every morning, right? Well, the last instance of this knocking, the door flew off its hinges, like somebody was dying to get in there. They're scared for their life. So I do believe it was a victim. It sure does, Joe agreed, looking around and no doubt comparing the changes that... Oh man, I lost my spot, didn't I? I've since come to the conclusion that, just as Brian says, there's something here now that likes to pose as her but isn't really him, Joe said. I raised an eyebrow. Brian Saunders was a psychic medium that Rob insisted was almost unbelievably accurate with his readings. Joe had definitely changed his tune since our last visit. Brian must have made quite an impression for Joe, seeing things so differently, and I was glad that Brian had considered to join us later on during the stay. We spent a few minutes listening to Joe's stories about his past experiences up there in the apartment, and then worked out our strategy for the rest of our investigation, or at least the parts where we would have access to Joe. I suggested that we break out the SLS cameras and pointed along the length of the apartment to see whether we could pick up any evidence of the spirits that had plagued Joe during his residency. At the same time, we would conduct an EVP session. After all, this was the same location where Joe had gotten the words, "the married one," on his own recorder. Maybe lightning would strike twice in the same place. Jason set up the SLS camera, positioning it to give maximum coverage of the kitchenette, bedroom, and closet, areas where the most paranormal activity had been experienced in the past. This camera uses a matrix of dispensed infrared light in order to detect figures that may be invisible to the human eye. Sometimes the camera mistakes tall, thin, planar objects, such as door frames and standing lamps, for being human beings, but quite often it will see human-shaped figures in the air. Some paranormal investigators work on the assumption that those anomalous figures may in fact be evil spirits or just spirits in general. We placed audio recorders at several different locations and left them running for the duration of the experiment. Then we switched out the lights. Joe recommended that we pay particular attention to the walk-in closet because a number of people, almost exclusively females, have found it to be the most intolerable to spend any time in. This is also the reported location of one of the portals that are said to be present at Fox Hollow Farm, the other being in the swimming pool. Several mediums have told Rob and Joe that the same story independently of one another, stating that the spirits came and went through the portal in the closet whenever they wanted to. I would never use that closet when I lived here, Joe told us. There's an energy in there. I just can't stand it. Caitlin gamely volunteered to spend some time in the closet, no small thing after having been touched on the back when she first entered the apartment. After 10 minutes, she emerged, declaring that it felt a little weird in there, but there was nothing that she could pin down specifically. It feels to me that somebody's back there, Joe said, indicating the darkened kitchenette and the hallway that cut through it. I can hear them moving around. Come on forward, whoever you are. Don't be shy. I looked closely at the SLS camera's output monitor. There was no sign of any life or movement back there. We began asking questions in the usual way, attempting to coax any spirit entities into coming out of hiding and communicating with us. Adamant that there was somebody lurking back there at the far end of the kitchenette, Joe took a few steps towards the sink. We could all see the stick figure representation on the SLS monitor, walking slowly into the dark, making the floorboards creak with every footstep. Then suddenly, a second figure emerged on the screen. This one was much smaller, perhaps the height of a toddler. It was also human-shaped, and it dashed forward until it was standing directly to Joe's right. Joe, don't move, I said. There's another figure, much smaller and farther away. I think it just came out of the bedroom. Go on out, it's okay. Joe stood still, peering in the darkness. There was nothing visible to the naked eye, and when I took a couple of flash photographs, nothing out of the ordinary showed up on them either. Yet there the figure was, standing at Joe's side, appearing to look up at him. He could feel something lightly touching the palm of his hand. We wasted no time in trying to debunk the finding. Jason pointed out that the SLS camera are sometimes susceptible to false positives. It's a function of the way that the software is written. The SLS computer code is always on the hunt for something that looks like a human figure, in the same way that human minds always want to look at a random pattern and see human shapes and faces within them. But that wasn't what we were dealing with here, in my opinion. For starters, there was nothing obvious for the camera to misinterpret as a small human figure because it was standing in the center of an empty hallway. The only object of any significance there was Joe himself and his stick figure. Twice the height of his anomaly was clearly visible to the right of the screen. Joe suddenly winced. His computer representation jerked backward a step. He had been poked in the chest, he told us, as if somebody had jabbed him with a couple of fingers. Then the figure abruptly disappeared. We spent the next 10 minutes trying to explain the SLS findings, moving Joe around through various positions in front of the camera, and seeing if the device would track any false positive objects. It never did. The only anomaly that appeared was a bat-sized moth. Conversation turned towards the subject of Tony Harris and his contention that much of the dark energy at Fox Hollow Farm came from an evil spirit that he maintained had been an assistant of sorts to Herb Baumeister. In life, this man's name was said to have been Joe, not to be confused with Joe LeBlanc, and Tony found him to be so abhorrent and reprehensible that he even refused to even mention his name, choosing instead to refer to him obliquely as SLJ, short for Sounds Like Joe. Joe LeBlanc's phone vibrated in his pocket, and what we have been an exceptional case of coincidence. He had just received a message from none other than Tony himself, saying that the two men needed to talk. Joe immediately called him back. His eyes were widened at something Tony said to him. We all waited with bated breath to find out what exactly that something was. When he hung up, Joe revealed that, according to Tony, SLJ was active at Fox Hollow Farm that evening and was prowling around the house because he was interested in what we were up to. Huh? It took a moment for us to digest the information. Researching claims of the paranormal had sometimes stretched my belief in the concept of coincidence to a whole new level. This was one of those cases. We had been mid-conversation on the subject of Tony Harris and SLJ when Tony Harris had called Joe to talk to him about SLJ. Unless the man happened to be hiding in the bushes outside with a parabolic microphone, there was no way he could possibly have known that. His timing was absolutely on point. The night was wearing on, and Joe had things to do on the next day. Thanking him for his help and company, we said our goodbyes and waved him off. Everybody was tired, and we all agreed to call it a night. I had a feeling that we would need some sleep before tackling Fox Hollow Farm again the following day.